vets here? Let me see, I can't see very far. Any World War II vets left in the crowd? They're getting dead on the ground. Korea. How do you do? Vietnam? Oh, yeah. In between. All right. Grenada? That's around. Any of the desert wars? Okay, so that tells me something about our collective age. I now know the demographics of this crowd age-wise, and we can draw a graph and shade. Are there board members of the museum here tonight? If so, please stand up. Candace, come on. Rick? Give these folks a hand. How many docents we have? Don't be shy, stand up. Come on.
Rick?
Yes. What?
Can you turn it up a little more? People here back here.
Speak into the mic.
We have a bunch of deaf folks.
That's it.
That's right.
Okay. Did the docent stand up when my attention was distracted, which is easy at my age? And we have a hand for those people. The museum is a volunteer organization. We're very, very young. We weren't started very many years ago. The way that it happened is thus. We decided it was time to have a museum. The Morrison family had bought a very historically significant house halfway across town, which means 4 blocks from here. And it didn't suit their needs, so they gave it to us. And we wrestled that spot away from the city. Any city council people here? It's true. And then erected it on this site. While it was going down, we heard 3 things constantly. 1, you can't do that. That's sort of standard, you always hear that. And 2, you can build a new building for cheaper. Well, that wasn't true. And besides that, there is the testimony of the thing itself. When you stand in that old building, that's that old building. And 3, there's no history in Port Aransas. So we set forth to prove them all wrong. I think we did a pretty good job of it. Now, tonight's guest brought to you at great expense and from far away. When I moved here to the island, nobody went beyond the stoplight because that was way out of town. I'm serious now. These folks just went and go way out there in the sticks. And now, of course, that's where about, from your hands, about 2/3 of your left part of the year comes Greg Smith. He's the 5th generation of the Dunn family. The Dunns are the folks who used to ranch this island after the Spaniards, and the Spaniards did so after the Karankawa. So it's been, our island has been occupied a long, long, long time. He is the CEO of Pioneer RV. Have you ever heard of that? He's a member of the advisory board at UTMSI, which is something to be very proud of. UTMSI is a really fine institution. He is a member of the Board of the Chamber of Commerce. I'm not sure if I were him, the president of whom is here, Ann Baum's in the crowd. Some director is in here. Is she hiding? No, unless she's not about to show up. Okay. And he has a lot of other qualifications, most of which you probably know. Here's the stuff that counts to me. He learned to ride when he was 5 years old. Had his first pony. He rode his first cow when he was 15, maybe 16. He's too old to remember. He has been a rancher most all of his life. He's going to give us a unique look at a particular period in our history that has to this point been almost neglected. We were looking for some photographs or some stories to close up a loop. We had a historical problem. We couldn't decide if these early reports were true. How in the dickens did they get the cattle from here over to the railroad at Quarantine Shore? It turned out they drove them across the creek that now has become the shipping area. You see those evil, greedy people in Corpus Christi went to the Congress of the United States, and Port Aransas was the seaport after 1910. And those folks from Corpus Christi went and took that away from us, but there was a problem. You couldn't get to Corpus Christi from here on a boat unless you had about a week, because there was only a creek going up there. That's the creek they used to drive the cattle across. Well, that still seemed a bit maybe far-fetched. And then we talked to Greg, and he said, oh yeah, I got a photograph. And he showed us a cattle drive across one of those creeks, which is now Padre Channel. So he solved the mystery for us. And with that mystery, we asked a local painter, Flint Reed, Big Friend Scout, to do a painting of a cattle crossing, which we then sold at the museum auction for a lot of money. So now we owe Greg not only for answering a historical question that we had no idea about, but for raising a whole bucket full of money to keep the museum going. Folks, please welcome Greg Smith.
Thank you, Rick. I'm glad to be here, and one thing Rick told me when he came, don't worry about the cruise. So, as what he just said is a good example of that. But I'd like to thank you, Rick, the 3 Marks with the Museum Society. What a terrific job that you all do out here, and for Port Aransas, what a great asset that you all do. But to give you a little bit of background, what Rick said, I've been involved with ranching. I worked for my grandfather, Burton Dunn, when I was 14 years old. And I spent 3 years taking him out to the island, helping him out, picked up a lot of the stories then. But as we were growing up, and I'm 5th generation, I've got the 5th generation, the 6th generation, maybe a 7th generation or 2 in here. It was all part of the family. So, and we were a big family, and when we were working cattle, you'd see all the aunts and the uncles and the cousins and things. So back in South Texas, ranching was a family affair with it. But I'll get going with it. This picture right here is a picture taken about the turn of the century, and I'm not talking about the 21st century, but the 20th century, about 1900. In the middle is Patrick Dunn. That's working cattle on the island. Now, with the island, these are longhorn cattle, and cattle first came to North America in 1517 with the arrival of Cortez. Both cattle and horses did, and some of them got free and they worked their way up here. In around 1760, the first ranch in South Texas, a true ranch. Before that, South Texas was just strictly Indian country. So the animals brought up here, we don't know when they became part of South Texas, probably in the 1600s or 1700s. Okay. The first ranchers, as we know them, are the North Americans with Padre Bailly. Padre Bailly was born in Reynosa around 1760. He acquired Padre Island. Padre Island now is named after him. Before that, it was called Isla Blanca, or the White Beach in Spanish. He acquired it when Spain still controlled Mexico, and he got his final title in 1828 after Mexico had become independent. Now, he was a priest, but I think the vow of poverty, he kind of forgot about that, because not only owned Padre Island, he owned several 100,000 acres in what is now South Texas. Now, he didn't ranch on our north. There's Point Isabel, and that is Point, because that's what it was known as before it became Port Isabel today. But this was the approximate location. He had about 1,000 head of cattle. He was not on there that long. He died in about 1830, and then he willed Padre Island to his two nephews with him. Around 1838 or 1839, this is Mustang Island, the southern end of Mustang Island. And a compatriot of Henry Kinney, who Henry Kinney founded Corpus Christi. This was a compatriot of him. Mustang Island was not owned by anybody, but he got Stewart to go out there on Mustang to lay claim to it by squatter's rights. So the first history we know of ranching on Mustang Island is the William Stewart ranch, but I don't think he probably ran much. There would have been a lot of cattle at that time, wild cattle and wild horses. Okay, Rick was talking about how you got to the island at that point in time. If you came from Corpus Christi, and Corpus Christi was a small town, not like we know it today, that was basically Corpus Christi. You had to take a boat, you came here, at that time you could go up the old Corpus Christi Pass and come up there. But we think, guys, we have to go to town, oh, I don't want to do it, it's going to be about a 30-minute ride. Back in those days, it was a 4 or 5 hour ride if the wind was blowing right. Otherwise, it could be an all-day affair. If you were going to go to Port Aransas, this is how you went. The ship channel did not exist at the time. It wasn't dug, as Rick alluded to earlier. You had to go around this. This was called Corpus Christi Bayou. Take it, come back around. This is about where the old Aransas Pass was in the 1850s. So this is how. Again, it was an all-day trip with it. Now, if you were going to go by land, you took your buggy, your horse, you came out here going about 4 miles an hour. After about 4 hours of riding, you would have crossed over right here. Then you would have gone across the Laguna Madre right there. So, okay. Now, I use the title, Long, Long Pasture. And on that slide, okay, you see New York and Philadelphia. That's the distance between New York and Philadelphia. The height of Burton Dunn ranching, that was the north boundary. And you can see the red line, that's the south boundary. It was over 110 miles. And this was in horse and buggy days too. So it wasn't like you went from one end of the ranch to another in a day. It was a week task. And you see these are the different camps. And at every camp, there was a couple of houses. One house was for the cowboys and one house was the patrons. And so those were about a wide distance away. And as you got further south, there was no camps there because there wasn't much grass. The better country was all up here. You know, you get down there toward South Padre and stuff. We all know that Port Aransas and North Padre is much better anyway. Always has been. Yeah. The first of the Dunns, my ancestor, which I'm the 5th generation, she arrived in Corpus Christi with her husband Thomas in 1849. This is a picture of the size of Corpus Christi in 1888, so you can imagine what the size was in 1849. Then the population was about 1,000 when that picture was taken. It was about 400. Catherine married her husband Thomas just before she got off the boat, or got on the boat from Dublin, Ireland, coming over here. Thomas had a letter from his brother Matthew that was in Corpus Christi in 1845 with Zachary Taylor's army. They were Irish. Ireland at that time was in starvation. There was barely enough food that actually about 3 million people died. And so you saw in that immigration, Matt wrote his brother, Tom, come on over. You know, it's great here. And so he did. Now, it wasn't as fast as that time, so from 1845 to 1849, that was a 4-year process. But they got married in the Dublin Cathedral, got on the boat. They were about 20 years old at the time. Leaving their family, coming to a new country, new opportunity, never to see their folks again or the rest of the family. They arrived here Arrived in Corpus Christi, they had a little bit of money. Thomas bought 100 acres from Henry Kenny. It is now part of the ship channel. It's 6 miles north of downtown Corpus Christi, but 6 miles in 1849 was an hour and a half away. So that would be about living in Victoria with it. But he was so proud to come back from the poverty of Ireland and be a farmer. And coming from Ireland, it was just 40 years that the Irish couldn't own land. The penal laws were just repealed. Up to 1790, it was illegal for the Irish Catholic to go to school, to own land and another other thing. So it was a great land of opportunity for them. And they got here, and Thomas worked hard. They started having children. Catherine became pregnant 8 times. She lost 5 of the children within the first 30 days of their birth. 3 of them survived. The first hospital in Corpus Christi was built in 1906. And so if you had to have an operation or anything prior to that, they came and you did it on your kitchen table. So here was Catherine. They came, 8 kids going. And things were going well. They were progressing. And by the time of the census in 1860, that Thomas had acquired $2,000. He had a cotton gin. He was prospering as a farmer. He was acquiring livestock. And then the Civil War. And the Civil War was very hard to this area. Not as far as battles. There were just a couple of little minor skirmishes that took place here. But the town was cut off. And there was, the Yankees had a blockade going, and so you had no ability to trade. So after that point in time, after the blockade came in 1862, that if you wanted something to eat, you either grew it, you caught it, or you killed it. Otherwise, you didn't eat. So then you were back to that point in time. Catherine and Thomas were kind of what they left, but at least they had something. They had 3 young kids and making their way through the Civil War. Thomas was just, in 1863, was drafted in the Confederate Army with it, and he was just about ready to go in, and they had the yellow fever epidemic. He died. Catherine was left. Her oldest child, 12 years old. Her youngest child, 5 years old. In the midst of the Civil War, nothing to go on with it. And I remember a couple of old stories. The Yankees would make forays. They ended up capturing Port Aransas. They would make forays into Corpus. Corpus was not defended. They would steal furniture out of houses and tear down houses for firewood. And a couple of things. One, Thomas, my great-grandfather Padre, the young Thomas Dunn, Yankee soldiers came in. He was a good soldier. He gave young Tom a pair of boots. Tom came home just elated. His first pair of boots, in this starving kind of area. Catherine, you can't keep those dirty Yankee boots. And he was just deflated. Here he was. Another time, and this is the old family lore, that Catherine was always a saver. She had a little bit of gold that was under a mattress. Yankees came in and one of their 4-ways, their winter savings, going across the bay to the blue bellies. So anyway, but to make ends meet, she had a couple of yoke of oxen. Again, this frontier lady, and she hauled firewood from the farm 6 miles out, and then they'd have to get water from the Oasis River with her young children. And she was ready to haul cotton down to Mexico, and luckily the war came to an end. And with that, a real sigh of relief. She had $100 still saved up in gold, so she was out of the business of having to haul firewood and water for a living. She bought a lot. Located right there, it's right in the middle where I-37 makes the turn, coming off the bridge right now. She lived there for the next 60 years. In 1879, Catherine had gone back, and through her hard work and determination, and I tell my daughter Catherine, Never let your sex hold you back. What your great-great-grandmother did in the face of this adversity, there's nothing that you can't do. But anyway, 1879, she formed a partnership with her son Patrick and her other son Thomas to start ranching on the island. Patrick, like all other good South Texas boys, grew up in the saddle, knowing ranching, and then South Texas was free-range country. What free-range is, there were no fences. You could run your cattle any place. As we know, land didn't exist, but people were starting to buy land. And so they were starting to put up fences. So everybody that relied on free range, it's just kind of like fishing is now, then you had to either buy some land or move further west. Well, Patrick thought, well, he'll go to Padre Island. And there were still no fences there. So he bought 400 head of cattle, went out and started on Padre Island. And it was actually Catherine that put up the money and the livestock for it. And then Thomas and Patrick put up the sweat equity. Patrick was 21 years old at that time. He moved out to the island. On there, and the first place he moved is close to where Bird Island is today. That's the settlement. There were a few other people living there at the time. I saw Pat Farley is here. Some of his ancestors, the Currys, lived at the settlement with it. And there were some people doing salt trades. And they didn't live on the beach side, as we all think, but they lived on the Laguna Madre side. But Patrick started acquiring title to the island. The ownership of Padre Island had spread out, and it was in about 20 or 30 hands. And Patrick at that time started rebuying it with it. And one of his purchases was the Staples tract, and they had a packer. We hear the name Packer Channel today. Then it was called Corpus Christi Pass. And it's located right there. So there's the Packer Channel Bridge. When you drive over it, you look over on the right where everybody is fishing. And that's where the original headquarters was at Patrick. And by that time, he pretty well acquired or leased title to all of the island except for the last 20 miles south where South Padre is today. This was the first house that he had on the island. Again, this is part of the old Staples Packery. This was added on. You can see it was pretty primitive. This is a tent. A lot of times you do. Here's how you got your water. The better water came off the roofs. The worst water came out of the cisterns. You can see Patrick sitting on the porch right there. And what you don't see, this is a pier going out into Packer Channel. And the Dunns, all of the Dunn family, this was where they would go in the summertime to get out of the heat of Corpus Christi. And they would land the boat on the channel where the Packer Channel is today. And there was a tee out there. And for somebody that had, and they'd bring their friends. And since it was a 4 or 5 hour trip, they'd stay for a week or two. And one of the initiations was, if you hadn't been there before, you'd get out and they'd throw you in the water off the end of the pier. My grandmother, Buena Vista Dunn Hill, or Buena Vista Hill Dunn, she had heard about that. And when she got there in about 1909, they got ready to throw her off. She pulled off her blouse. She had a bathing suit over it. She took all the wind right out of her sails. Now this is where Patrick lived in Corpus. So you can see his adobe on the island is not quite what he had in Corpus. Now Patrick, not only was he a rancher, but he served 3 terms in the legislature for the state of Texas, beginning in 1911 with it. And a couple of things. He was an early conservationist. And he was chairman of what was now the Parks and Wildlife. Back then it was called the Fish, Game, and Oyster Commission. And the oystermen, they thought that brown pelicans were one of the worst nuisances that happened. They wanted to shoot and kill every brown pelican that existed because they were eating the oysters. Patrick, being the chairman on there, he stopped it. stop the oystermen from wiping out the brown pelicans. So he was an early Tony Amos. Also, this is a Rosette Spoonbill. He sponsored the first bill that outlawed the sale of feathers. They had, then there was active millinery trade where women's hats, if you were cool at all, you had feathers coming from tropical birds from Florida or either Texas. So he sponsored the bill that outlawed the sale of feathers in Texas. Now, the other house that I showed you earlier, that was destroyed in the 1916 storm. That was in September of 1916, and it was probably water that got it, because when they went there, there was nothing left to be found. Patrick's son, my grandfather Burton, was down about 40 miles down the island in what we call the Green Hill Camp. He was down there with his cousin Chris. And Granddaddy always told me that story, that the campsite was back behind the dunes, about 500 yards behind the dunes. And back then, you didn't know about a storm. You're just sitting down there like anybody else. It's a day in September. Corpus Christi really hadn't been hit by storms since it had been founded. They had a few brushes and stuff, but no major blows. And the wind started coming up and things, and the water started coming up, and they got concerned, and they went in one of the old camp houses there, and the wind kept going, and the water kept going, and Chris, his cousin, his older cousin, Chris McGowan, said, Burton, I think we need to make for the sand hills. They didn't call them sand dunes, they called them sand hills. We need to make it for the sand hills. And so they did. And they worked their way several hundred yards to sand hills. And he said, we had coyotes, we had rattlesnakes, we had jackrabbits, horses, cattle, everything else sharing those dunes. Everybody just hunkered down, and that was it. So they rode out the storm there. The storm actually made landfall north of there with it. But back in Corpus Christi, Catherine, two of her grandsons, lost. Storm came through, the first storm, Padre. They were given up for dead. They sent a party out for them, looking at them, and a great sigh of relief. It was actually published in the paper. Burton, Dunn, and Chris McGowan found after the storm. So, but Catherine at that time, and her grandkids, and kind of her two boys at 92, she died about 30 days after that. And I always wondered, maybe some of the stress and the strain in that 92-year-old constitution could have led to her early demise in 92. But anyway, that was the 1916 storm. That's what happened to that fine mansion you saw a little bit earlier. This is a replacement house. This was built in 1917. We call it today Padre House. This house still exists. I've offered it to the folks on Padre Island to make a little museum out of it, dedicated to ranching, but they lack Fort Aransas's ability or enjoyment of their history. With it, I'm dealing right now with windstorm, what's going on right there, but I kind of look at this old house. They built them okay in 1917 because it made it through the 1919 storm, the 1933 storm,